Imagine, imagine, if you will, a completely ordinary Friday.
Okay.
You know, it's the end of the week, it's the end of the month, and you just got paid.
Always a good feeling.
Right. You check your banking app, you see your money sitting there safely in your checking account, and your weekend plans are totally set.
You've got it all mapped out.
Exactly. You're going to buy groceries, maybe take the family out to dinner, pay your rent, maybe finally buy that new refrigerator you've been, saving up for.
Yeah, just normal, everyday life stuff.
Right. And you go to sleep feeling perfectly secure. But then Monday morning rolls around.
And the weekend's over.
It's over. You walk up to an ATM, you slide your card in, and the machine essentially just says no.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you walk into the bank branch, right? And the teller looks you in the eye and tells you that your own money, the balance that is literally still staring back at you on the screen, the money you spent all month earning, is locked away.
Just completely inaccessible.
Completely. You are only allowed to take out a tiny microscopic fraction of it per week. Barely enough to cover basic food. Everything else, frozen, untouchable.
I mean, it sounds like the opening scene of a dystopian science fiction movie, right?
Yeah, totally.
It's the kind of scenario that plays on our deepest, most primal fears about modern society. Just the absolute fragility of the complex financial systems that we, rely on every single day.
Exactly. But the terrifying thing here is, this isn't a dystopian novel. It isn't a movie script.
Right.
It's exactly what happened to millions and millions of Argentines in December 2001. They literally woke up to this exact reality.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. And today we're doing a deep dive into how an economic so-called miracle that was designed to save a country ended up trapping its citizens in a total financial nightmare.
Yeah, we're relying on some incredible source material today, specifically excerpts from the document El Corralito Argentino, Cuando el dinero quedó detrás de una ventanilla.
Which translates to the Argentine Corralito, when money stayed behind a window.
Exactly. And our mission today is to really dissect the anatomy of that 2001 Argentine financial collapse. We want to explore how a seemingly perfect economic magic trick, a policy engineered to end hyperinflation, slowly mutated over a decade into an inescapable trap.
A trap that ended up destroying a nation's middle class and just completely rewriting its political landscape.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it becomes really clear why this matters to you, the listener, right now, regardless of where you live or, what currency you use.
Because it's not just local history.
Exactly. This isn't just a lesson in South American economic history. It is an absolute masterclass in the psychology of money.
Oh, I love that.
Right. It forces us to confront the reality of what money actually is. Because at its core, money isn't just paper or digital ones and zeros.
It's a social contract.
Yes, it's an invisible web of trust between a citizen, their bank, and their government. And what we are looking at today, in agonizing detail, is exactly what happens when that invisible social contract violently shatters.
The rupture of a basic contract. That idea alone gives me chills. Because you take your money to the bank with the ironclad promise that you can get it back whenever you need it.
That's the whole deal.
Right. And when that promise breaks, absolutely everything breaks.
Right.
Society literally stops functioning.
It grinds to a halt.
But, to understand the incredible trauma of what happened in December 2001, we have to rewind. We have to go back a full decade to understand the trauma of the 1980s.
Because that's what necessitated such a drastic economic intervention in the first place.
Exactly. Context is everything here.
It really is. You can't understand the extreme nature of the medicine if you don't understand the severity of the disease. And the disease ravaging Argentina in the late 1980s and into 1991 was uncontrolled hyperinflation.
Right. And when we say hyperinflation, we aren't talking about, like, the price of eggs going up 50 cents over a year.
No, not at all.
We are talking about a society where prices changed at an absurd, dizzying speed. A worker's salary would literally lose its purchasing power between the day they were paid and the day they went grocery shopping.
What's fascinating here is the sheer psychological toll that takes on a population.
I can't even imagine.
Try to imagine the anxiety of that daily existence. You receive your paycheck, and instead of feeling a sense of relief or accomplishment, the clock starts ticking immediately.
You have to run.
Literally, you have to sprint to the store to convert that paper money into physical goods. Flour, oil, canned food, anything tangible.
Because if you wait until tomorrow,
or even later that same afternoon, that same stack of bills might buy half as much. The national currency, the currency of the sovereign state of Argentina, had completely ceased to be a store of value.
It failed at one of the fundamental purposes of money.
Exactly. It was just pieces of paper at that point.
Like a hot potato you have to get rid of instantly before it burns your hands.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And so, into this absolute nightmare steps a man named Domingo Cavallo. He becomes the Minister of Economy under President Carlos Menem.
Right, the architect.
Yeah. And Cavallo introduces something called the convertibility law in 1991. The rule of this law was incredibly simple, which made it immensely powerful politically.
Simple is usually an easy sell.
Exactly. The rule was 1 peso equals 1 US dollar.
It's a brilliant piece of political messaging because of that simplicity. Everyone can understand 1 to 1.
Right.
But we really have to emphasize a crucial point here. This was not a metaphor. It was not a target the central bank was casually aiming for.
It was a legally mandated parity.
Yes. By law, the exchange rate was locked.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second, because locking a currency by law sounds great on paper, but how do you actually enforce that in reality?
Take some serious financial engineering.
Right, because you can't just pass a law saying the sky is green and expect it to change color. If the market thinks your peso is worthless, how do they magically make 1 peso equal $1?
The mechanics are the most critical part of this whole story. To make that legal mandate a reality, the convertibility law fundamentally stripped the Argentine central bank of its ability to act like a normal central bank.
Oh, wow. In what way?
Well, the law required that the central bank had to back every single peso printed with an equivalent amount of foreign currency reserves, specifically U.S. dollars sitting physically in its vaults.
So wait, if they wanted to print a new peso bill and put it into circulation, they physically had to have a real U.S. dollar in the vault to match it.
Exactly. No dollar, no peso.
That is wild.
But it's exactly why it worked to stop hyperinflation. Because the root cause of the hyperinflation in the 1980s was the state printing unbacked money to fund its massive deficits.
They were just creating money out of thin air to pay their bills.
Right, which rapidly devalued all the existing money. The convertibility law completely halted state money printing. It took the printing press away from the politicians, locked it in a box, and threw away the key.
So they essentially outsourced their monetary credibility.
Precisely. They outsourced it to the United States Federal Reserve. Because the peso was now just a legally binding proxy for the U.S. dollar, people started trusting it again, almost overnight.
And the immediate results were nothing short of miraculous, according to the sources. The convertibility law achieved incredible price stability.
Almost instantly.
And with that stability came a massive economic recovery in those first few years. There was a profound psychological shift. People could finally plan again.
Think about what a relief that must have been.
Seriously, after years of the grocery store sprint, you could finally save money for next year without worrying that it would just evaporate into nothing.
It was a return to normalcy, and then some. This stability manifested in everyday life in ways that completely transformed the country. Credit returned to the economy.
Installment payments came back then.
Yeah. The ability to buy a refrigerator or a car and actually pay for it over time. Traveling abroad became entirely possible for the middle class. Buying imported goods became cheap and accessible.
So for the urban middle-class sectors, the 1990s created a completely new sensation. It felt like living in a stable, first-world economy, totally connected to the U.S. dollar and the global market.
It must have felt like absolute magic.
You know, I was thinking about this, and the best way I can picture it is an analogy. Let me try this out on you.
Oh, I'm ready. Let's hear it.
Okay, so imagine the Argentine economy in the 1980s is this incredibly leaky, unstable, wooden rowboat. And it's getting violently tossed around in a hurricane of hyperinflation.
Okay, terrifying visual.
Right, people are bailing water, just desperately trying to survive the storm.
Right.
Then Domingo Cavallo comes along with the convertibility law. And what he essentially does is take a massive, unbreakable titanium chain and ties that leaky rowboat directly to the side of a colossal nuclear-powered steel cruise ship, the U.S. dollar.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Suddenly, the rowboat stops rocking. It's moving fast, it's cutting through the waves smoothly, and anyone sitting in that rowboat feels incredibly stable and secure. They feel like they are riding on the cruise ship.
That is a brilliant analogy. The people in the rowboat get to enjoy the smooth ride provided by the massive engines of the cruise ship.
Exactly.
They get the stability of the U.S. economy without having to build a cruise ship themselves. It's an instant, massive upgrade to their quality of life.
But, and here's the massive but that drives this entire historical tragedy.
Here we go.
If everything felt so stable, so prosperous, and so secure, how did this supposed magic trick actually plant the seeds for a total catastrophic collapse.
Right, because while the stability was very real to the people experiencing it, the foundation of that stability was built on a hidden macroeconomic flaw.
A flaw in the system.
Exactly. It was built on borrowed time, and more importantly, it was built on borrowed dollars. The 101 peg was essentially a trap.
The illusion of eternal wealth. The sources point out that the deep, profound weakness here was that Argentina had basically adopted a currency that was simply too expensive, too strong for its actual economic output.
Think back to the mechanics of the law we just discussed. To maintain a fixed currency backed entirely by reserves, a country must constantly produce and attract those reserves.
Right, they need dollars to print pesos.
Yes, it must bring physical dollars into the country. You do this through a healthy trade surplus, exporting more manufactured goods or agricultural products than you import, or by attracting real long-term foreign investment where companies build factories and hire people.
But Argentina did not manage to do this in a sufficient and sustained way. They couldn't produce enough real dollars through trade to justify the incredibly strong currency they were using.
Which is a huge problem.
So if you can't earn the dollars through exports, but the law says you absolutely must have them to keep the economy running and the peso backed, what do?
You borrow them. And this is exactly where the jaws of the trap begin to close. The economy began to take on massive indebtedness.
So the government is just taking out loans to keep the lights on.
Yeah, the state started asking for borrowed dollars from international markets to cover its everyday expenses, to pay off previous debts that were coming due, and crucially, to maintain the illusion of confidence.
Because if the reserves drop,
If the central bank's dollar reserves dropped, confidence in the one-to-one peg would immediately drop. So they borrowed just to keep the vault full and the psychological illusion alive.
and it wasn't just the national government doing this. The provinces were taking on huge debt. Private companies were taking out massive loans in dollars.
It was systemic.
And even regular families were taking out dollar-denominated loans because the interest rates seemed so convenient and low compared to the old days of peso inflation.
This is a critical detail. Everyone was drinking the same Kool-Aid. Families and small businesses grew deeply accustomed to an economy where the dollar seemed totally stable. It felt eternal, almost like a law of nature.
Wait, hold on. Let me push back on this a little bit. Because it's really easy, with the benefit of hindsight, to point the finger entirely at the politicians and the architects of the policy.
Of course.
But you're telling me everyday people like families, small mom-and-pop shops, were taking out 20, 30-year mortgages in U.S. dollars while earning their daily salaries in pesos. Didn't anyone see the massive red flag there?
It sounds crazy now, I know.
If the peg breaks, your debt multiplies overnight. Weren't they ignoring an incredibly obvious risk?
It's a completely fair question, but it speaks to a very dangerous quirk of human psychology: normalcy bias. We adapt to the new normal remarkably fast.
Okay, I can see that.
Remember, the 1980s were a time of daily, exhausting financial terror. Then the 1990s bring a decade of total, unwavering price stability. 10 years is a very long time in human experience.
That's true. 10 years is a whole era.
Right. If you experience 10 solid years where 1 peso always, without fail, equals $1, your brain starts to treat it as a fundamental law of physics, like gravity.
So they just assume a decade of stability guarantees a lifetime of it?
Exactly. Why wouldn't a family take a low-interest dollar mortgage to buy a home when the government, the banks, and the Constitution itself basically promise that the exchange rate will never, ever change?
They weren't being intentionally reckless?
No, they were making rational economic choices based on the rules of the game as presented to them by the state. But that eternal stability was a total illusion.
And the convertibility law, the very titanium chain that saved them, became a structural straitjacket. It left the Argentine economy with absolutely zero margin for maneuver.
If we look at the plumbing of global macroeconomics, a normal country has tools to fight an economic downturn.
Right, levers they can pull.
Yes. If a country enters a recession, its central bank can devalue its currency. This makes its exports cheaper on the global market, which boosts foreign sales, brings in foreign money, and stimulates the domestic economy.
Makes sense.
Alternatively, the central bank can print more money to lower interest rates and encourage domestic borrowing and spending.
But Argentina couldn't do either of those things.
Neither of them.
The law absolutely forbade printing unbacked money. and the law absolutely forbade devaluing the peso. They essentially threw away the steering wheel and the brakes in exchange for that smooth ride on the cruise ship.
And then the macroeconomic weather changed. By 1998, an economic contraction began, a recession that would drag on for years.
Wasn't a sudden crash then?
No, it wasn't a sudden overnight stock market crash. It was a slow, cumulative, agonizing deterioration of the real economy.
The slow-motion train wreck. And then comes the external shock. In 1999, neighboring Brazil devalues its currency. And the source text points out this is absolutely devastating for Argentina.
A total nightmare for their exports.
Exactly. Why? Because the Argentine peso is chained to the incredibly strong U.S. dollar. So suddenly, Argentine products become hopelessly expensive and completely uncompetitive compared to Brazilian goods.
Put yourself in the shoes of an international buyer or even a domestic Argentine consumer. If you can buy a Brazilian manufactured good, say a car part or a textile, for half the price of the exact same Argentine good, simply because the Brazilian currency is weaker, what are you going to do?
You buy the Brazilian good. Every time.
Exactly. You buy Brazilian.
So the factories in Argentina start selling less. The shops start reducing their staff to cut costs. Unemployment begins to climb aggressively.
It starts a cascade effect.
Right. And because people are out of work and businesses are selling less, the government's tax collection just plummets.
This creates a terrifying vicious cycle. Less economic activity means less tax revenue for the state, but the state still has to pay the massive compounding interest on all that dollar-denominated debt it took out during the 90s.
The debt doesn't just go away.
No, it grows. Less tax revenue leads to a higher government deficit. To cover that deficit, the government needs to borrow more money.
But the economy is visibly shrinking.
Exactly. And because the economy is shrinking and the debt is growing, international lenders see Argentina as a much higher risk.
And higher risk means the lenders demand higher interest rates to hand over that money, which means the debt grows even faster, requiring even more borrowing just to pay the interest. It's a classic death spiral.
For the international creditors, Argentina was no longer just a country in debt. It was a country that was mathematically going to have extreme difficulties paying. The numbers simply no longer worked.
Which brings us to the political paralysis. As the economic math broke down, this crisis morphed from a spreadsheet problem into a severe, paralyzing crisis of political authority.
The politics get very messy here.
In December 1999, Fernando de la Rúa takes power as president, heading a coalition called the Alianza.
De la Rúa inherits a spectacularly poisoned chalice.
That's a great way to put it.
He inherited an economy in a deep structural recession, soaring unemployment, a persistent fiscal deficit, and a mountain of external debt that was becoming impossible to refinance.
And his mandate from the voters was essentially an impossible paradox. His central problem was that he promised to fix the crisis, clean up the corruption, and correct the excesses of the previous administration.
All good things.
Right. But he promised to do it without touching the convertibility law. He had to fix the overheated machine without being allowed to touch the engine.
Because touching the convertibility law was viewed as absolute political suicide. The public still viscerally remembered the trauma of the 1980s hyperinflation.
They wouldn't let it go.
The one-to-one peg was the holy grail of stability. It was untouchable. But trying to solve massive debt and the recession while keeping the currency artificially expensive? It's like trying to heal a compound fracture by just giving the patient stronger painkillers while forcing them to run marathons.
Wow.
The underlying bone is only splintering further.
And so, the political backing for his coalition starts to crumble rapidly. In October 2000, his vice president, Chacho Alvarez, resigns over a scandal involving presumed bribes in the Senate.
Which is a huge blow to their anti-corruption platform.
Exactly. The crisis was no longer solely economic. It was a total crisis of authority. The president appeared incredibly isolated. His cabinet became a revolving door. Ministers of economy were entering and leaving constantly.
When you have ministers like Machinia and Lopez Murphy cycling through the most important economic post in a matter of months, it creates massive instability.
The markets must have been freaking out.
Absolutely. When the global markets and the domestic public see a new captain at the helm every few weeks, they know the ship is lost. The streets were filling with the palpable feeling that the government had absolutely no clear exit strategy.
And because Argentina desperately needed external financing just to keep making its daily debt payments and avoid an immediate default, a massive new player steps to the forefront. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF.
A very familiar player in Latin American economics.
Right. They became the decisive actor in whether Argentina lived or died financially.
The dynamic with the IMF is crucial to understand here. The IMF offered to back Argentina to provide the immense funds needed to avoid default.
But there's always a catch.
Always. That support came with strict, unyielding macroeconomic conditions. The IMF demanded intense fiscal discipline.
Meaning brutal, sweeping spending cuts.
Exactly. Reduction of the deficit, massive cuts to public spending, structural reforms, and absolute guarantees that the country could prioritize paying its debt.
But doing that during a recession.
It's incredibly punishing. If we look at the math of austerity during a recession, it's brutal. In a country already suffering from rising unemployment, cutting government spending removes even more money from the economy.
Right. It means fewer infrastructure projects, lower public sector wages, less money flowing into local businesses.
Yes. It deepens the recession further, which lowers tax revenues further, which makes the deficit worse.
It's the ultimate rock in a hard place. So in December 2000, they announced a massive assistance package, an international bailout called the blindage, which literally means financial armor.
That's some very optimistic branding.
Right. It was tens of billions of dollars. It was supposed to secure the funds and, most importantly, restore the confidence of the global markets. But the texts show us that it failed.
It failed because confidence is not something you can just buy with a giant loan.
The market could see through it.
Exactly. If the underlying math of the economy is broken, if your currency is too strong to export anything, and your debt burden is larger than your growth, the market knows it. The blinders was just throwing good money after bad.
And so, by March 2001, with the crisis deepening into an abyss, De la Rua is desperate. He reaches for the only card left in the deck. He brings back Domingo Cavallo,
The architect himself.
the very man who created the convertibility law a decade earlier. He returns as the Minister of Economy with extraordinary sweeping emergency powers.
It's a huge dramatic moment.
He was the man a large part of society associated with the miracle of the early 90s. It was literally like calling in the retired superhero who saved the city 10 years ago to save it one last time.
But the tragic flaw in that hope was that Cavallo returned to a vastly different Argentina than the one he had saved in 1991.
The magic trick wouldn't work twice.
No, it couldn't. He was trying to use the blunt tools of 1991 to solve the completely different, much more complex, deeply structural crisis of 2001.
And this brings us to the evaporation of trust. Because in a financial crisis, confidence is worth exactly as much as money. Actually, it's worth more.
It's the only thing that matters.
Right. And in 2001, Argentine confidence was just vaporizing into thin air.
The mechanics of the bank run that followed are terrifying. When confidence goes, the smart money always moves first.
Always.
Large institutional investors, multinational corporations, and wealthy individuals look at the shrinking central bank reserves, look at the mounting debt, and realize the government cannot mathematically maintain the one-to-one peg forever.
They know a devaluation is inevitable.
Exactly. So while their pesos are still technically worth $1, they convert millions and millions of them into actual physical dollars and wire them to offshore accounts in New York or Switzerland.
And everyday people aren't blind to this. They see the writing on the wall.
They feel the panic.
Everyday savers started withdrawing their deposits. Some just wanted physical cash hidden in their houses, mattress money. Others were buying dollars if they could get their hands on them.
In November 2001 alone, a staggering amount of money fled the system, nearly $2.917 billion.
In 1 month.
In a single month, almost $3 billion physically removed from the Argentine banking system.
And this triggers the ultimate nightmare of modern finance. Let's talk about the trap the banks were in, because this is the mechanism that turns fear into total systemic collapse.
The banks were in an impossible position.
Right, because they faced a dangerous problem. They didn't have all the bills available to handle a massive, simultaneous withdrawal by all their clients. Now, I know our listeners understand the basics of fractional reserve banking. Banks lend out deposits, so the cash isn't all sitting in the vault.
Right, that's how banking works everywhere.
But why was this specific bank run in Argentina so incredibly lethal?
Because of the specific, highly toxic asset the banks were holding. In a normal economy, banks lend your deposits to businesses expanding or families buying homes.
Okay.
But the Argentine state, desperate for financing to keep the convertibility illusion alive, had absorbed immense resources from the banking system. The banks had taken the depositors' money and used a massive portion of it to buy government bonds.
Oh, wow. So the banks were entirely exposed to the sovereign debt.
Completely exposed.
If the government goes broke and can't pay the interest on its bonds, the banks go broke. And if the public sees the government going broke, they know their deposits are vaporizing.
It was an inescapable trap. If the state couldn't pay, the banks were insolvent. And if the banks were insolvent, the depositors ran faster to withdraw their money.
It just feeds on itself.
And as they withdrew money, they converted it to dollars, which meant the central bank was bleeding its dollar reserves, which, remember, were the only thing legally keeping the peso afloat.
Because of the convertibility law.
Every single dollar that left the country weakened the visible promise of that law.
Let me throw another analogy at you, because the standard musical chairs idea doesn't quite capture the sheer panic and structural failure here.
Okay, let's hear it.
Imagine a massive airline, let's call it Convertibility Airlines. They have a policy of overbooking flights, which is normal, but they've overbooked a flight to Miami by 10,000%.
That's a lot of overbooking.
They sold 10,000 tickets for a plane with 100 seats, operating on the assumption that only 1% of people ever show up to the airport on any given day.
A risky strategy, but mathematically manageable under perfect everyday conditions.
Right. But suddenly, a Category 5 hurricane is spotted bearing down on the city. Now, all 10,000 people rush the gate at the exact same time, desperate to get on that 100-seat plane.
Total chaos.
The gate agents, who are the banks in this scenario, are completely overrun. There physically aren't enough seats. The panic itself is what causes the total collapse of the system.
That is exactly what happened. The realization of absolute scarcity causes the panic, and the panic causes the collapse.
So when the banks literally run out of the physical paper needed to hand people their life savings, what is the government's next move? The authorities faced a brutal, apocalyptic decision.
There were no good options left.
As the capital flight accelerated, they had to choose between two catastrophic options. Option A, allow the bank run to continue until the entire banking system literally runs out of physical cash, shutting down every bank permanently.
Which would be catastrophic.
Or Option B, limit the withdrawal of cash. Pull the lever and freeze the country's money supply.
And Minister Cavallo, staring into the financial abyss, chose the second option. He pulled the lever.
The trap snaps shut. The government issues Decree 1570-2001 on December 1st. It goes into effect on Monday, December 3rd, 2001.
And the core restriction of this decree was the limit of 250 pesos or dollars per week for cash withdrawals.
250.
It also severely restricted transfers abroad and attempted to forcibly pivot the economy onto a digital track, mandating payments by checks, credit cards, and electronic bank transfers.
Okay, 250 a week. Now, there is a fascinating and ultimately tragic contrast here between Cavallo's official theory and the reality on the ground. Let's look at Cavallo's defense for a second.
Right, because he had a rationale.
He argued that the measure did not totally freeze or steal the money. He insisted the money wasn't gone or expropriated. You could still use your debit cards, you could write checks, you could make electronic transfers to pay your rent or buy a car.
In theory, yes.
The goal, he claimed, was just to stop the physical paper bills from fleeing the system and draining the vault, not to steal people's savings.
From a purely technical macroeconomic standpoint,
Right.
sitting in an air-conditioned government office looking at spreadsheets, you can almost see the logic.
Right. On paper, it works.
If everyone just calmly switches to digital payments overnight, the economy keeps moving without draining the physical dollar reserves. But the fatal flaw in that logic is its violent collision with reality.
The ground reality was totally different.
The Argentina of 2001 was deeply, fundamentally reliant on physical cash. The country was absolutely not prepared to live without it.
The source documents emphasize this. Many small businesses simply did not possess the infrastructure to take cards.
Not at all.
Think about the massive informal economy. Millions of workers, from construction laborers to domestic workers to street vendors, were paid their wages entirely in physical cash.
You can't wire transfer a street vendor.
Exactly. Families couldn't pay rent to their landlords, they couldn't buy groceries in the neighborhood corner shops, or cover daily transportation with an electronic bank transfer. In the towns and the working-class neighborhoods, an electronic payment system was a distant, futuristic promise, not a reality.
If we connect this to the everyday lived experience, suddenly, having money in the bank no longer guaranteed your capacity to survive. The money was trapped.
And this is where the press and the public gave the crisis its unforgettable, profoundly cynical name.
El Corralito.
Corralito, the playpen.
The image is incredibly exact.
Why? Because the deposits were right there. You could see them. They were visible on your printed bank statement, almost mocking you.
Just like a toddler in a playpen can see their favorite toys just outside the bars.
Yes. The saver was locked behind an administrative barrier, staring directly at their own money, but completely unable to reach out and touch it.
And the domestic economic impact was devastating and immediate.
I mean, $250 a week.
Right. The limit of $250 a week might seem like a manageable amount for a single young person with very low expenses, but how does a business operate?
It can't.
For a small or medium enterprise, a factory, or a family with higher medical expenses, it was a death sentence. If you had to pay for a life-saving medical operation, settle an urgent debt with a supplier, pay school fees, or make payroll for 20 employees, a $250 limit was an absolute condemnation.
The numbers mentioned in the texts are staggering. Merchants reported sales dropping by up to 50% almost instantly.
Half their business, gone.
Importers and exporters couldn't collect or pay for operations. The everyday economy didn't just slow down. The engine seized up entirely.
And it is vital to understand why it seized up. The economy didn't stop because people suddenly lacked needs. It didn't stop because people didn't want to work or produce.
It stopped simply because the physical medium of exchange, the blood in the economic veins, ceased to circulate.
Exactly. It paralyzed everyone from the wealthy business owner down to the pensioner.
Here's where it gets profoundly sad. I want to go back to that idea of the rupture of a basic contract.
Yeah.
You give the bank your money, they hold it, and they give it back when you ask. It's the foundational rule of modern capitalism. When that rule breaks, society breaks. How quickly does civil obedience rely on financial access?
Almost instantaneously. Money is the lubricant of civil society. When you remove it, the gears grind together, heat up, and spark.
That's a great metaphor.
When a citizen realizes the state and the financial institutions will not honor their most basic fundamental agreements, the legitimacy of the entire system evaporates. The social contract is voided, which leads us directly to the explosion.
The freezing of cash wasn't just a severe inconvenience. It became the spark that ignited a historically unprecedented social and political explosion.
But the tension had been accumulating long before December 3rd.
Yes, the context of immense human suffering was already there. Poverty, severe unemployment, and the massive drop in consumption were already violently battering the working classes.
It was a pressure cooker.
Lootings of supermarkets and shops were breaking out in various cities. These were not abstract scenes of macroeconomic crisis. These were desperate people who literally could not afford to feed their children.
The pressure cooker is whistling. And then, on December 19th, President Fernando de la Rúa makes a fateful, catastrophic decision.
He speaks on national television and declares a state of siege across the entire country.
Which is essentially martial law, suspending constitutional guarantees, allowing arrests without warrants, all to ostensibly restore public order.
But instead of restoring order, this authoritarian reflex threw gasoline on a raging political fire. It absolutely incensed the population.
It backfired spectacularly.
That very night, something incredible happens, something entirely spontaneous. In neighborhoods across Buenos Aires and other major cities, thousands of people began coming out to their balconies, standing on street corners and marching down avenues.
Just spontaneous outrage.
And they were carrying pots, pans, ladles, and metal lids. They were banging them together with furious energy. The Casa Rosada.
It's a massive, deafening auditory protest. There is no central organization, no single political party called for this march, no union leader coordinated it.
It was pure, unadulterated anger.
Bronca. The sound of the pots mixed with car horns, shouts, and sirens as ordinary people, middle class, working class, everyone marched toward the city centers.
And the rallying cry they chanted. The entire protest condensed into one single, devastating phrase.
Que se vayan todos.
They all must go.
They all must go.
This raises a critical point about the nature of this anger. This was not just a protest against Domingo Cavallo or just against President de la Rúa.
It was much broader than that.
It was a total, absolute rejection of the entirety of the political and economic class. The targets of the anger were universal. The political leadership, the financial system, the IMF, the foreign banks, the local banks, and an entire decade of promises that had ultimately ended in massive unemployment and confiscated deposits.
I want to pause here and just highlight something crucial about the que se vayan todos sentiment that we see in the sources.
You sure?
Because it's important we present this exactly as it happened. This anger wasn't partisan in the way we usually think about politics. It wasn't the left marching against the right or the right marching against the
Well,
left.
no, it transcended all of that. The anger was directed at everyone in power, indiscriminately. They blamed the right-leaning market policies of the 90s. They blamed the left-leaning politicians in the Alianza coalition who failed to fix it. They blamed the international institutions, and they blamed the local bank managers.
Nobody was spared.
Que se vayan todos literally meant everyone. It was a complete and utter vacuum of legitimacy for any established authority.
Exactly. When the social contract of money breaks, the political contract shatters right along with it. By the morning of December 20th, Buenos Aires was under massive, overwhelming mobilization. The Plaza de Mayo, the historic square in front of the presidential palace, became the epicenter of the protests.
And the state's response was incredibly violent. Police repression, tear gas, rubber bullets, and mounted police charging into crowds.
It was brutal.
The state violence left dead and injured across the country. The crisis claimed fatal victims.
The political structure simply collapsed under the weight of the streets. Minister Cavallo resigned first, his reputation in ruins. And then, hours later, President Fernando de la Rúa penned his resignation.
Which leads to one of the most tragic and iconic images in Argentine history, completely etched into the national memory. The presidential helicopter taking off from the roof of the Casa Rosada, the executive mansion, fleeing the scene, while the massive protests, the tear gas, and the chaos raged on down below in the plaza.
But the departure of the president was not the end of the crisis. It was merely the collapse of a government. The underlying financial trap, the crushing debt, the frozen money in the banks, the fundamentally broken currency peg was still there.
The fire was still burning.
The building was still roaring with fire, even though the fire chief had fled in a helicopter.
And the institutional chaos that followed is just mind-boggling. We see a vertiginous sequence of leadership.
A revolving door of presidents.
Right. The provisional president of the Senate, Ramón Puerta, takes over temporarily. Then the Legislative Assembly elects Adolfo Rodriguez Sá as president. He lasts exactly 1 week, then he resigns.
What?
Then the president of the Chamber of Deputies, Eduardo Camaño, takes over briefly. Finally, on January 1st, 2002, the Assembly designates Eduardo Duhalde as president.
That is 5 presidents in less than 2 weeks. The phrase "que se vayan todos" had found an almost literal institutional translation. They were all cycling through and leaving.
I want to ask you something about the demographics of this suffering, based on what the text highlight.
Okay.
You pointed out earlier that the crisis hit the poorest sectors the hardest initially, the people rioting for basic food. But the sources specifically note how the Corralito shattered the identity of the urban middle class. Why them, specifically? Why did this strike at the core of the middle class identity?
What's fascinating here is the psychological and sociological fracture. The poorest households were already suffering extreme precariousness. The crisis deepened their hunger. But the Corralito made visible a very specific vulnerability in the middle-class sectors.
They felt they had done everything right.
Exactly. These were people who had felt insulated. They felt protected by their savings, by their professional degrees, by their small businesses, and crucially, by their access to the formal global banking system.
They played by the rules. They did everything society told them to do.
Yes. Imagine a doctor who suddenly couldn't withdraw their own money to pay for medical supplies for their clinic. An architect whose construction project was completely paralyzed because they couldn't pay the contractors.
Or a small business owner.
A bookstore owner who couldn't restock inventory. A lifelong retiree who had a nest egg sitting safely in the bank but no physical cash to buy groceries. A professional with a dollar account discovering the prestigious international bank could not hand over the bills they had deposited.
This altered the very identity of a middle class that had associated saving money in a bank with security, responsibility, and upward social mobility.
It was a profound shock to their worldview.
The images of these middle-class people in suits and nice coats, physically taking hammers and beating the metal shutters of the banks, weren't just protests. They were the physical expression of a psychological rupture. Citizens violently demanding access to money that legally had their name on it but was materially out of their reach. It's devastating.
It is the ultimate betrayal of the promise of the 1990s. The illusion of being a first-world stable economy was violently, irrevocably stripped away. And the new leadership, this rotating cast of presidents, now had to dismantle the macroeconomic bomb that Cavallo and De la Rua left behind.
And the way they dismantle it.
The math they use to unwind the peg creates massive winners and absolute losers.
So the trap is still there, and the government has to do something. President Rodriguez Sá, during his brief one-week tenure, takes a monumental step. On December 23, 2001, he announces that Argentina will suspend payment on its external public debt.
The country formally entered into default.
The largest in history at the time.
This was the largest sovereign default in global history up to that point. And interestingly, the declaration was received with cheers and applause inside the Congress building.
But the grim reality outside the building remained unchanged. Defaulting on international debt didn't unlock the trapped deposits in the Corralito. It didn't solve the skyrocketing unemployment.
It didn't put food on the table.
It didn't end the economic paralysis of the streets.
It merely acknowledged the mathematical reality that the state was broke. It falls to Eduardo Duhalde, who takes over on January 1st, 2002, to accept the final ultimate truth that Cavallo and De la Rua had refused to accept.
That the peg had to go.
The convertibility law, the one-to-one peg, could no longer be sustained. The titanium chain had to be cut. It was dead.
On January 6, 2002, Congress passes the public emergency law. The era of 1 peso equaling $1 is officially over. The peso begins to devalue.
A huge moment.
At first, they try to set an official controlled exchange rate of 1.4 pesos per dollar for certain things. But eventually, the dollar begins to float freely, and the peso loses value rapidly. In a few short months, the cost of $1 shoots up past 3 pesos.
Think about the immediate consequence of that. For anyone earning a salary in pesos, their purchasing power is annihilated overnight as inflation returns with a vengeance. And the prices of goods, especially imported ones, skyrocket.
The true nightmare, the most complex and painful part of unwinding this crisis, involves the debts and the deposits.
This is where we get into a policy called pacification asymmetrica asymmetric pacification.
And honestly, looking at the mechanics of this in our sources, it is just wild to me. The government decrees that many obligations and deposits that were originally denominated in U.S. dollars will be forcibly converted into Argentine pesos.
Right.
But they don't use the same conversion rate for everyone.
This is the critical asymmetry. Let's walk through the exact math of how this played out because it's important.
Okay, let's break it down.
The government decided that dollar-denominated debts, money that people or corporations owed to the banks, were largely pacified at a rate of 1 peso per dollar.
So wait, let me get this straight. If I owed a bank $100,000 for a mortgage or a business loan,
you now miraculously only owed 100,000 pesos. Because the real free market dollar was now worth 3 pesos, your real debt burden was massively artificially reduced. You could pay off that debt with a fraction of its real value.
this essentially saved the debtors, particularly large corporations with massive dollar debts.
Exactly.
Okay, so the debtors get a massive bailout. But what about the savers? What about the middle-class family that had $100,000 saved up in the bank for retirement?
The dollar deposits, the savings, were transformed into pesos at a rate of 1.40 pesos per dollar, plus some later adjustment mechanisms that barely dented inflation.
Okay, so 1.40.
Right, so your $100,000 in savings became 140,000 pesos. But remember, the free market dollar was shooting past 3 pesos.
Oh my God.
To buy your $100,000 back, you would need over 300,000 pesos.
Wait, so an everyday saver who had deposited real U.S. dollars, playing by the rules, was handed back pesos that had radically less purchasing power than the dollars they originally put in.
That's the math.
They lost more than half their wealth instantly by government decree.
That is exactly what happened.
That is an experience of outright dispossession. The government essentially changed the rules of the game after the whistle was blown.
It feels incredibly unfair.
You save your whole life, and suddenly the value of your life's work doesn't depend on your effort or even the free market. It depends entirely on a panicked government decree that explicitly decides to punish savers in order to subsidize debtors.
That is precisely how the citizens experienced it. People discovered that the security of their savings no longer depended on their prudence, but on an arbitrary administrative decision taken in the middle of an emergency.
The wealth transfer is insane.
The difference in conversion rates orchestrated a catastrophic wealth transfer. A massive corporation could end up paying off a colossal loan incredibly cheaply, while a retired teacher watched the purchasing power of their life's nest egg evaporate as the peso crashed.
And as if that wasn't enough, the Corralito, the initial limit on cash withdrawals, evolved into something even more restrictive.
It got worse.
It became the Corralón, the big playpen.
Yeah.
Fixed-term deposits in many accounts were completely immobilized or forcibly rescheduled to be paid back over a period of many years in devalued bonds.
The damage to the trust in the banking system was profound, structural, and lasting.
I bet.
For years and decades afterward, the simple question, is my money safe in the bank, carried a heavy, traumatic weight in Argentina that is hard for outsiders to grasp. People chose to hoard physical dollars in safety deposit boxes, hide them under floorboards in their homes, or move them out of the country entirely rather than ever trust a local bank again.
The financial system technically survived, but it survived with an enormous, ugly scar.
And the human toll of all this macroeconomic maneuvering is just devastating. The devaluation, the drop in economic activity, the surging unemployment, and the subsequent inflation caused poverty to absolutely skyrocket.
Over 50%, right?
Yes. In 2002, more than half the population of Argentina fell below the poverty line. Unemployment spiked over 20%.
We really have to look past the macro percentages and look at the concrete lives altered. The source text talks about community soup kitchens overflowing, struggling to feed the newly poor.
People were forced to invent alternative economies just to survive.
True barter clubs emerged across the country. People trading clothes, home-cooked food, and professional services in literal barter markets because official currency was either trapped in the bank or worthless.
It's like going back in time.
Multi-generational families were moving back in together because no one could afford separate rent. There was a mass emigration of educated youth leaving the country for Europe or the U.S., fleeing a collapse of opportunities. Adults with decades of formal work experience were left unemployed and with zero liquid savings to fall back on.
It's an agonizing picture. And this brings us to a major moral and political debate regarding the crisis that the texts highlight.
The big question, was this whole nightmare inevitable?
Historical records present two distinct sides to this debate, and it is important we look at both impartially to understand the complexity.
Let's hear both sides.
On one side, you have the defense of Domingo Cavallo. He always argued that the Corralito was an absolute mathematical necessity. In his view, it was the only possible way to prevent a total catastrophic bank run that would have physically destroyed the banks and eradicated the entire payment system of the country.
Okay, so he sees it as a necessary evil.
Right. His version is that it was meant to be a temporary, stabilizing measure to force the economy to use electronic means while the panic subsided.
But on the other side, the critics are fiercely opposed to that narrative. They argue that the Corralito wasn't a sudden act of God, but the inevitable result of a policy that arrived way too late. They point out that the government sat by for months while reserves bled out, capital fled the country, and the political situation deteriorated. They question why the massive flight of dollars by big institutional investors and the ultra-wealthy wasn't controlled earlier in the year.
Why was the smart money allowed to leave?
Right. And most importantly, they condemn the fact that the final crushing cost of unwinding the crisis fell squarely on the shoulders of the small and medium savers who couldn't move their money to Miami in time.
And this discussion is not just technical, it is deeply moral. It poses the agonizing questions that linger over any systemic financial crisis. Who was tipped off to take their funds out before the restrictions hit?
Who had the resources to access offshore dollars?
Who was forced by the state to absorb the losses? And who was left trapped behind the window? In a crisis of this magnitude, these moral questions matter just as much as the economic figures.
It's a heavy, heavy legacy to process. As we synthesize what we've learned today from these sources, it's worth noting that the Corralito did eventually end. In December 2002, Minister of Economy Roberto Lavagna announced the liberation of retained deposits.
But the episode did not really end that day, did it?
No, it didn't. The trauma became embedded in the political and economic language of Argentina. It cemented a deep, generational distrust toward banks and the national currency itself.
It lived on in the memory of every person who had to stand in line outside a bank.
Holding a useless debit card or staring at a fixed-term deposit they legally couldn't touch.
If we pull back and look at the core lesson from all these documents, it's this. The Corralito wasn't some random meteor that struck the economy on a random Saturday in December 2001.
It was a long time coming.
It was the physical, visible manifestation of an entire decade of hidden macroeconomic rot. The massive debt accumulation, the rigid currency peg that couldn't bend so it had to break, the endless recession, the fiscal deficit, the capital flight, and the profound political fragility.
All of those complex failures coalesced into one concrete, brutal limit, $250 a week.
That is a powerful thought. $250 is a tiny figure compared to the macroeconomic magnitude of the billions of dollars of national debt. But it was enough for millions of people to understand, in the hardest way possible, that an economy can collapse in the balance sheets years before it finally collapses in the kitchen of a family home.
It collapses on the spreadsheets before it hits your dinner table. That is such a profound takeaway, and it connects directly to you, the listener, right now.
It really does.
Because whenever you pull out your phone and look at your banking app, you need to realize you aren't actually looking at physical money. You are looking at a promise.
A complex social contract.
Exactly. The 2001 Argentine crisis is a masterclass in what happens when an entire society suddenly realizes that the promise simply cannot be kept. The numbers on the screen mean absolutely nothing if the system behind them fails.
It is a stark reminder of the immense fragility of the systems we trust blindly every single day.
And I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over on your own. A thought that builds on what we've discussed today. In 2001, the freeze was so devastating precisely because Argentina was still a cash-heavy economy. They couldn't adapt to purely digital transactions in time to save the everyday commerce of the streets.
Right. Cash was king.
But look at our world today. We are accelerating toward a purely digital economy. Cash is becoming practically obsolete in many places. So imagine if a systemic panic triggered a modern digital Corralito tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
What if the servers just went offline, or accounts were frozen by automated risk management algorithms during a crisis? If the digital window slammed shut today, how much faster would our deeply interconnected society unravel without any physical bills left in our pockets to fall back on? Think about that the next time you tap your card. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.